Don't expect money. We didn't want you then and don't want you now. My biological mother's words hit me like ice water standing in the marble foyer of their mansion. I'd imagined this moment for 52 years, and Margaret Whitmore had just shattered every dream with one calculated sentence. But little did she know my daughter Emily was about to walk through that door and give them exactly what they deserve to hear. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me backtrack and tell you how a 68-year-old woman ended up face to face with the billionaire parents who abandoned her more than half a century ago. 4 months earlier, I'd finally gotten the DNA results I'd been waiting for. After decades of dead ends, false leads, and bureaucratic walls, a simple spit test had cracked the case wide open. The Whitmore family, real estate moguls worth over $2 billion. My biological parents were listed as Margaret Whitmore 93 and Edward Whitmore 95. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire life working double shifts as a diner waitress in Akron, Ohio, scraping together enough to raise my daughter Emily as a single mother. Meanwhile, my birth parents were living in a 32-room mansion in Santa Barbara, California, probably spending more on wine in a month than I'd made in a year. But here's the thing about being abandoned as a baby. You develop a thick skin and a sharp tongue. Both were about to come in handy. I'd hired a private investigator named George Miller, who specialized in family reunification cases. "Mrs. Carter," he'd told me over coffee, "I need to prepare you for the possibility that they might not want contact." I'd laughed at that. After more than 5 decades of wondering, I was ready for anything. Or so I thought. George had done his homework. The Whitmores had one acknowledged son, Charles, who was 66, and apparently as charming as a root canal. No mention of any daughter given up for adoption. "They've never publicly acknowledged you," George had explained gently. This might be complicated. Complicated, that was going to be the understatement of the century. George had worked for 3 weeks to even get a response from their legal team. Turns out billionaires don't just let strangers waltz up to their front door, even strangers with DNA evidence. Finally, after providing extensive documentation and agreeing to a background check that probably knew more about me than I did, Margaret Whitmore's assistant called. "Mrs. Whitmore can spare 30 minutes for this matter," she'd said, like I was a pest control appointment. But I'd waited 52 years. 30 minutes was 30 minutes more than I'd ever had. The drive from Akron to Santa Barbara had given me 48 hours to imagine every possible scenario. I'd pictured tears, apologies, maybe even a family dinner, where I'd finally understand where I got my stubborn streak and my inability to suffer fools gladly. Emily had wanted to come with me, but I'd insisted on going alone. "Mom, you don't have to face this by yourself," she'd said. My daughter, bless her heart, had inherited my protective instincts. "Sweetheart, I've been alone my whole life. I can handle 2 old people with more money than sense." Besides, Emily was in pre-production meetings for her next film. At 39, she'd become one of Hollywood's most bankable leading ladies, though she still called me every Sunday, like the good daughter she was. The success she'd achieved still amazed me. From community theater in Akron to Hollywood A-lister talk about beating the odds. The Whitmore estate sat behind iron gates that probably cost more than my entire house. Security cameras tracked my rental car as I approached the intercom. After stating my business and showing identification to the camera, the gates slowly opened. As I crunched up the gravel driveway, I had to admit I was impressed despite myself. Manicured gardens stretched as far as I could see, and the mansion looked like something out of Architectural Digest. A butler answered the door. An actual butler, complete with the accent and everything. "Mrs. Carter, I presume," he said, looking me up and down like I might steal the silverware. "That's me, Helen Carter. But everyone calls me Nell. I figured if we were doing this, we might as well get comfortable." The butler, Alfred Bennett, he introduced himself, led me through hallways lined with paintings that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Mrs. Whitmore is waiting in the conservatory," he said. I had to bite back a laugh. Of course she was waiting in the conservatory. Where else would a billionaire wait for the daughter she'd thrown away? My hands were steadier than I'd expected as we walked. Maybe it was all those years of handling difficult customers at the diner. Or maybe I was just too curious to be nervous. Either way, I was about to meet the woman who'd carried me for 9 months and then decided I wasn't worth keeping. The conservatory was all glass and expensive plants with a view of the valley that would have taken my breath away if I hadn't been focused on the woman sitting ramrod straight in a leather chair. Margaret Whitmore was 93 years old, but looked like she could outlive me out of pure spite. Margaret Whitmore examined me like I was a specimen under a microscope, her pale blue eyes cold and calculating. She was impeccably dressed in what I assumed was designer everything. Her silver hair styled in a way that probably required a team of professionals. I, on the other hand, was wearing my best dress from JCPenney. And the confidence that comes from knowing you've earned every wrinkle on your face. So she said without preamble, "You're the child, not my daughter, or even Helen. Just the child." Like I was a mistake she'd been hoping would stay buried. "I'm Helen Carter," I replied, settling into the chair Alfred had positioned across from her. "Though I suppose you already knew that." I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She waved a dismissive hand. "Names can be changed. DNA, unfortunately, cannot." The way she said "unfortunately" made it clear she'd have preferred if modern science had stayed out of her business. "I assume you want something," she continued. "They always do." I felt my temper start to simmer. They always do. How many long-lost children had knocked on her door? "I want answers," I said simply. "I've spent my entire life wondering who I am, where I come from, why I was given away." Margaret's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked bored. "You were given away because you were inconvenient," she said matter-of-factly. "Edward and I were young, focused on building our fortune. A baby would have been a distraction." A distraction. 68 years of wondering, and I was a distraction. "I see," I managed. And now she leaned back in her chair, studying me again. "Now you're here, and I suppose you expect some sort of compensation for your troubles." The word compensation dripped with disdain. That's when she delivered the line that would stick with me forever. "Don't expect money. We didn't want you then and don't want you now." The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. This woman had just dismissed my entire existence like I was asking for spare change. But I'd learned a long time ago that the best response to cruelty is grace under pressure. "Well," I said, standing up slowly, "that's certainly clear." I smoothed down my dress and looked around the conservatory one more time. Beautiful plants, by the way. Must take a lot of care to keep something thriving in such a cold environment. If she caught the double meaning, she didn't show it. "Where do you think you're going?" Margaret's voice cut through the conservatory like a blade. I'd been walking toward the door, but apparently our little chat wasn't over yet. "I assumed we were finished," I replied, turning back to face her. "You've made your position quite clear." She gestured for me to sit back down. "Edward hasn't met you yet. It would be rude to leave without seeing him." Oh, how thoughtful. After 52 years of silence, she was suddenly concerned about rudeness. But I was curious about the man who'd helped create me and then walked away. "Of course," I said, settling back into my chair. "Wouldn't want to be rude." The sarcasm was probably lost on her, but it made me feel better. Edward Whitmore entered the conservatory 10 minutes later, moving slowly with the aid of an ornate walking stick. Where Margaret was cold steel, Edward was faded grandeur. He'd probably been handsome once, but now he just looked like an old man who'd lived too long and seen too much. "So you're Helen," he said, lowering himself into a chair beside Margaret. "You have the family eyes." "That's what the DNA test suggested," I replied. "At least he'd use my name. It was a small improvement over being called the child. He studied me for a long moment. "What do you do for work?" he asked. Margaret shot him a look that could have frozen hell itself. Apparently, we weren't supposed to get personal. "I'm a waitress," I said proudly. "Been working at Joe's Diner in Akron for 23 years. I'd seen enough shame in my life to know I wasn't going to start feeling it now." Edward nodded slowly. "Honest work," he said. Margaret's expression suggested she disagreed. "Edward," she said sharply, "we've already discussed this situation." Situation. That's what I was to them. A situation to be managed. "Have you?" I asked. "Because I haven't discussed anything yet. I haven't told you about my daughter or my life or what I've built from nothing." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "We're not interested in your accomplishments." The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway interrupted us. Alfred appeared in the doorway looking more composed than he had when he'd first answered the door. "Madam, there's a Ms. Carter here to see you. She says she's Mrs. Carter's daughter and that she's expected." My heart skipped a beat. Expected Emily and I had talked about this visit extensively over the past week, and she'd made me promise to call her the moment I left the estate. Expected, Margaret asked sharply. Alfred nodded. "She has identification, and she does bear a resemblance to Mrs. Carter. She also mentioned she sent a text message earlier today." That's when I remembered Emily had indeed texted me during my drive, saying she'd wrapped her meetings early and might try to join me if I needed moral support. Emily Carter swept into the conservatory like she owned the place, which given her current box office status, she might as well have. My daughter had inherited my height, but added Hollywood glamour to it. Even in jeans and a simple sweater, she commanded attention in a way that made Margaret Whitmore look like a museum piece. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," Emily said, kissing my cheek before turning to face my biological parents. "The flight from Seattle was delayed, and then traffic from the airport was murder." Margaret and Edward stared at her with the kind of recognition that comes from seeing someone on magazine covers and movie screens. "You're..." Margaret began for the first time since I'd arrived, looking genuinely surprised. "Emily Carter," my daughter said with the smile that had launched a dozen romantic comedies. "Helen's daughter, your granddaughter, I suppose." I watched Edward's face go through several expressions before settling on something that might have been pride. Typical. They couldn't be bothered with a diner waitress, but a movie star granddaughter was suddenly interesting. "I thought you were in meetings," I said to Emily, still processing her unexpected arrival. "Wrapped early yesterday," she replied, settling into a chair beside me. "I flew down this morning. I wasn't going to let you face this alone, especially after you called last night sounding so nervous." She was right. I had called her rambling about my anxiety for the meeting. She looked around the conservatory with the kind of polite interest she'd perfected for talk show appearances. "Beautiful home. Must be worth, what, 60 million, maybe 70. Margaret recovered her composure quickly. "We weren't expecting additional guests," she said stiffly. Emily's smile never wavered. "Well, that seems to be a pattern with you two, doesn't it? Not expecting people?" The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "Emily?" I started, but she held up a hand. "It's okay, Mom. I've been looking forward to meeting them." She turned back to Margaret and Edward. "You know I've heard so much about you over the years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone in my life." Mom wondered if her birth parents ever thought about her, if they ever regretted their choice. Edward shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Margaret remained stone-faced. "And now I know the answer," Emily continued. "You didn't think about her. You don't regret anything. In fact, you're treating her like she's here to steal the silver rather than finally meet the people who created her." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Then Margaret spoke. "We owe her nothing," she said to Emily as if I wasn't sitting right there. "She's lived her life. We've lived ours. Emily leaned back in her chair, and I recognized the expression on her face. It was the same one I got right before I told a difficult customer exactly what I thought of their attitude. "You're absolutely right," Emily said, her voice deceptively calm. "You don't owe her anything, but I'm curious about something." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it. "Mom mentioned you've been quite generous with charities over the years. I looked into that during my flight." Margaret and Edward exchanged glances. "What are you talking about?" Margaret asked. Emily held up her phone. "Well, according to publicly available tax records, amazing what you can find when you know where to look. You've donated quite a bit to children's charities over the decades." She paused for effect. "The most interesting donation was the $4 million you gave to St. Mary's Orphanage in 1960, just 2 years after my mother was born." The silence in the room was deafening. St. Mary's. That was where I'd grown up, where the nuns had told me my parents were young and unmarried, unable to care for a child, where I'd spent my childhood wondering if love would ever find me. $4 million in 1960, Emily repeated. "That's about $35 million in today's money. That's a lot of money to give to an orphanage." Margaret finally found her voice. "That donation was made for tax purposes," she said, but her composure was cracking like ice in spring. "Was it?" Emily asked innocently. "Because according to the records, it came with a very specific stipulation. The money was to be used exclusively for children who were, what was the phrase, placed due to difficult family circumstances." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. They'd given millions to help children like me while simultaneously pretending I didn't exist. "You donated money to help abandoned children while refusing to acknowledge your own," I said quietly. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. "There's more," Emily said, consulting her phone again. $3 million to St. Luke's Children's Hospital in 1976, $5 million to the Hope for Families Foundation in 1984, another $7 million to various adoption agencies over the years. She looked up at them. $32 million in total to help children who were given away, but not one penny to the child you actually gave away. Edward was no longer looking at us. His eyes were fixed on his hands, and for the first time he looked every one of his 95 years. "We were trying to do good," he said weakly. "We were young when Helen was born. We thought—" "You thought you could buy your way out of guilt," Emily finished. "Newsflash, it didn't work." That's when we heard a car door slam outside, followed by raised voices. Alfred appeared in the doorway, looking genuinely distressed. "Sir, Madam, Master Charles is here. He seems agitated." Charles Whitmore burst into the conservatory like a storm front, his face red with exertion and what I assumed was panic. He was a soft-looking man in his 60s with the kind of paunch that came from too many business lunches and not enough physical labor. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was sweating profusely. "Mother, father," he gasped. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He stopped short when he saw Emily and me. "You actually let them in?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea what this could cost us?" Margaret straightened in her chair. "Charles, meet your half-sister Helen and your niece Emily." Charles's eyes widened as he recognized my daughter, but his panic quickly overshadowed any starstruck moment. "This is a disaster," he said, pacing the length of the conservatory. "I got a call from our head of security 20 minutes ago. Apparently, someone's been making inquiries about our family trust. Professional inquiries." He turned to Emily. "I assume that was you." Emily smiled sweetly. "Actually, that would be my business manager, Linda Park. She's very thorough when it comes to protecting my interests, and apparently protecting my family's interests, too." She pulled out her phone. "Funny thing about being a successful actress, you get access to some very expensive legal minds. When I heard Mom was coming here, I asked Linda to do some research." "What kind of research?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with concern. Emily consulted her phone. Well, turns out Linda used to work for Morgan Stanley before she became a talent manager. She knows how to read financial documents, and she has friends who specialize in family trust law. Charles's face had gone pale. What exactly did she find? Emily's expression grew serious. She found that your grandfather was apparently much smarter than any of you realized. When he set up the original family trust in 1953, he included what's called a bloodline protection clause. Basically, any biological heir with legitimate DNA evidence is entitled to an equal share of family assets. The room felt like it was spinning. How much are we talking about? I asked quietly. Emily looked at her phone again. Well, according to Linda's research, the family trust is worth approximately $2 billion. Charles gets a third as the acknowledged son, and any other biological children get equal shares of the remaining assets. She looked up at me. Congratulations, Mom. You're entitled to about $700 million. Margaret made a choking sound. That's impossible. We would have changed that clause years ago if we'd known about it. Emily shook her head. Can't. That's the brilliant part. Your grandfather included a specific provision that the bloodline clause could only be removed with unanimous consent of all living heirs. Since you never acknowledged Helen, she was never asked for consent. Charles was gripping the back of a chair so hard his knuckles were white. This will destroy everything, he whispered. The board, the shareholders, the business partnerships, they all depend on stable family control. Emily tilted her head sympathetically. That does sound like a problem for you. Stop, Charles said, his voice rising to near hysteria. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about money. It's about 40 years of business relationships, partnerships, board positions. If word gets out that there's been a hidden heir for 68 years, it'll create chaos in every deal we've ever made. Emily stood up and began walking around the conservatory like she was delivering a closing argument. You know what, Charles, I'm starting to understand the family dynamic here. She gestured toward Margaret and Edward. Your parents abandoned their daughter because she was inconvenient for their business plans. And now you're having a panic attack because acknowledging her might be inconvenient for yours. You don't understand the complexity, Charles started, but Emily cut him off. Oh, I understand perfectly. I work in an industry where image is everything, where one scandal can end a career. The difference is, I don't throw family members under the bus to protect my bottom line. She pulled out another folder from her purse. Linda also found some interesting information about your recent business activities. Apparently, you've been quietly moving assets around, transferring properties to offshore companies, restructuring debt obligations. She looked directly at Charles, almost like he knew this day might come. Edward's walking stick clattered to the floor. How could you possibly know about those transactions? He asked weakly. Emily's smile was sharp. Linda has friends everywhere, including at the IRS. When you move that much money around, people notice. The question is, why were you preparing for this if you never expected it to happen? Margaret's mask was completely gone now. She looked old and tired, and maybe for the first time, a little bit scared. We've always known the clause existed, she admitted quietly. Our lawyers have been looking for a way around it for decades. And you never found one, Emily continued, because your grandfather was smarter than all of you combined. He wanted to make sure the family fortune went to family, not just to whoever happened to be convenient at the time. She turned to me. Mom, you're not just entitled to this money. You're entitled to a board seat, voting rights, and full access to all family business records. Charles made a sound like a wounded animal. She can't just walk in here and take over everything we've built. Emily's expression hardened. Everything you built? From what I can see, you inherited an empire and have been coasting on your grandfather's vision ever since. That's when my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt a chill run down my spine. Linda says we have a problem, I read aloud. Apparently, someone at the Whitmore legal firm has been asking questions about me. They know about my visit. Charles's face flushed red. I called our attorneys the moment security told me about the inquiries. We have rights too. You know we can protect ourselves. Emily laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Protect yourselves. From what? From having to acknowledge the daughter you threw away. From financial extortion, Charles snapped. From people who think they can waltz in here and demand money from families who've worked for generations to build something meaningful. The venom in his voice was breathtaking. This was my half-brother, and he saw me as nothing more than a threat to his bank account. Financial extortion. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years. Charles, I didn't even know about any inheritance until 10 minutes ago. I came here for answers, not money. I looked from Margaret to Edward to Charles. I wanted to know why. I wanted to understand how 3 people could create a life and then just forget about it. Margaret tried to speak, but I held up my hand. For 68 years, I've wondered if you ever thought about me. If you ever regretted your choice, if you ever wondered what kind of person I became. I walked to the window overlooking their perfect gardens. I wanted to know if I had your eyes, your smile, your stubbornness. I wanted family. We were 25 and 27. Margaret said quietly. Edward's family business was failing. My father was threatening to disown me if I didn't marry someone who could save the family finances. We thought a baby would ruin everything we were trying to build. So you built an empire instead, I said, turning back to them. Congratulations. Was it worth it? Edward retrieved his walking stick with shaking hands. We told ourselves you'd be better off, he said. That a young couple could give you things we couldn't, a stable home love attention. Did you ever check? I asked. Did you ever wonder if your assumptions were right? Their silence was answer enough. Because if you had, I continued, you would have learned that I was placed with the Collinses, a couple in their 50s who'd given up hope of having children. Robert worked in a factory. Evelyn cleaned houses. They had more love than money, but they gave me everything they had. The pain in my chest was familiar now. They died when I was 20. Car accident on their way to my college graduation. After that, it was just me. No family, no safety net, no trust fund to fall back on. I gestured around the conservatory. So, yes, I built my life from nothing. And yes, I made mistakes, but I never abandoned a child. Margaret was crying now, silent tears that carved tracks through her perfectly applied makeup. We can't undo what we did, she said. We can't go back and make different choices. For the first time since I'd walked into this house, she sounded human. No, I agreed. You can't. But you can choose what happens next. Emily moved to stand beside me, and I felt her hand slip into mine. My daughter, my greatest accomplishment, the proof that love could triumph over circumstances. I've made my choice, I said to Margaret, Edward, and Charles. I don't want your money. I want nothing from you except one thing. Charles looked up hopefully. I want you to establish a foundation in my adoptive parents' names, Robert and Evelyn Collins. Use my share of the inheritance to help children in foster care find permanent loving homes. The room was completely silent. Then Charles spoke. You're giving up $700 million. I'm giving it to people who understand what family really means, I replied. Unlike the 3 of you. Charles stared at me like I'd lost my mind. You can't be serious. You're walking away from $700 million. I nodded calmly. I've lived 68 years without your money. I think I'll manage just fine. But Charles wasn't done. You can't just give it away either. The foundation idea would require board approval, legal restructuring, tax implications. It could take years. Emily pulled out her phone again. Actually, according to Linda, Helen has the right to assign her inheritance to any charitable organization she chooses. It's called a charitable trust assignment, and it can be executed immediately. She smiled at Charles. Your grandfather really was thorough. There's another issue, Margaret said quietly. If Helen establishes this foundation, it will be public record. The media will investigate why she's donating such a large sum. The story will come out anyway. She looked at Emily. Your mother's identity, your relationship to our family, everything we've tried to keep private. Emily's expression grew thoughtful. You know what? You're right. This will be a huge story. Movie star's mother discovers billionaire birth parents. Family reunion after 68 years. The daughter, who was given away, returns to give back. She paused. Of course, how the story gets told depends a lot on how cooperative everyone is. Charles's face was turning red again. Are you threatening us? Emily shook her head. I'm offering you a choice. We can do this quietly with dignity, focusing on the positive aspects of Helen's decision to help children in need. Or we can do it the other way, where I start giving interviews about how my mother was treated when she tried to reconnect with her birth family. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. For the first time since I'd arrived, the Whitmores were the ones at a disadvantage. What do you want? Margaret asked quietly. I want my mother to be treated with respect, Emily said simply. I want acknowledgement that she exists, that she's always existed, and that giving her away was a mistake. And I want this foundation established exactly as she's requested, with full family support. Edward had been silent through most of this exchange, but now he spoke up. What about Charles? What about his position with the company, his inheritance? Emily looked at my half-brother with something that might have been pity. Charles keeps his third of the inheritance, his board position, his business relationships. All we're asking is that he stop treating my mother like she's here to steal something that was never really his to begin with. And if we refuse? Charles asked. Emily's smile returned, but it wasn't warm. Then Linda has a very different conversation with her friends at the financial press, and I have a very different conversation with my publicist. She paused. Your choice. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, Margaret spoke. What would you need from us? A public statement, Emily said without hesitation, acknowledging Helen as your daughter and explaining the circumstances of her adoption in a way that shows respect for all parties involved. She pulled out her phone and began reading. Linda already drafted something. The Whitmore family is pleased to announce the reunion with Margaret and Edward's daughter, Helen Carter, who was placed for adoption in 1960 due to the young parents' circumstances at the time. We are proud of the extraordinary life Helen has built and are honored to support her decision to establish the Collins Foundation for Foster Care, named after her loving adoptive parents. How does that sound? Margaret and Edward exchanged a long look. 68 years of marriage, and they could still communicate without words. It sounds fair, Margaret said finally. Charles opened his mouth to protest, but Edward held up his hand. Helen, Edward said, looking directly at me for the first time since this conversation began. I want you to know that not a day has passed in 68 years that I haven't thought about you, about what kind of woman you became, whether you were happy, whether you found love. His voice broke slightly. Once I know, it doesn't excuse what we did, but you were never forgotten. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. Then why didn't you ever try to find me? He was quiet for a long moment. Because we were cowards. Because we told ourselves you were better off without us. because admitting we'd made a mistake would have meant facing what we'd given up. Margaret stood up slowly, her composure finally completely gone. Helen, I know you'll probably never forgive us. I know we don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that giving you away was the biggest mistake of my life. Not because of the money, not because of the publicity, but because I lost the chance to know an extraordinary woman. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph yellowed with age. This is the only picture I have of you taken at the hospital before. She couldn't finish the sentence. The photo showed a tiny baby with dark hair and serious eyes. Me, 68 years ago. I've carried this with me every day since 1960, Margaret continued. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I want you to have it. She held out the photograph with trembling hands. I looked at the picture, then at these 3 people who shared my DNA, but had never shared my life. I'll take it, I said finally. Not because it changes anything, but because every child deserves to know where they came from. Emily moved to my side. There's one more thing, she said to Margaret, Edward, and Charles. The foundation will be headquartered in Akron, Ohio. Helen will remain on the board, but she'll continue living her life exactly as she chooses. No family obligations, no expectations, no strings attached. I smiled at my daughter, understanding what she was doing. She was making sure I could accept their money for the foundation without accepting them into my life. And if any of you want a relationship with me, I added, you'll have to earn it starting from scratch. Like any family relationship should be built on respect, trust, and genuine care. Margaret nodded through her tears. We understand. Charles still looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but he didn't protest. The legal paperwork would take weeks to complete, but the important conversation was over. As Emily and I walked toward the conservatory door, I felt lighter than I had in years. I'd found my birth family, learned the truth about where I came from, and discovered that sometimes the family you choose is worth more than the one you're born into. You know what the best part is, I said to Emily as we reached our rental car. She smiled at me, this brilliant, successful woman who still called me every Sunday. What's that, Mom? I already had everything I needed. I just didn't realize it until now. We drove away from the Whitmore mansion, leaving behind a lifetime of questions and taking with us the only answer that really mattered. Love isn't about blood or money or even time. It's about choosing to show up for each other every single day. And I'd been blessed with someone who'd been showing up for me since the day she was born. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.